Hello, my name's Jaden Chong. I'm one of the teachers here at Vincent Music. I'm just conducting this video lesson from home. Please excuse any background noise that you may hear. There's roadworks and house construction going on near my house, so I do apologize for any background noise that seeps in. So, the thing that I'm going to be talking about today is in reference with using the piano pedaling, as well as some articulation techniques that might be helpful for them. So, in relation with piano pedaling, this is one of the tricky cornerstones of piano technique, I find. So, using the piano pedal, for those who aren't aware, what it does is basically turns some of your notes from, whether it's just your regular legato notes, into something which is much more sustained, or having much more of a kind of, well, a sustained tone, or otherwise, some will call it a wet tone. So note that when I'm using the pedal, I have to take great care of making sure some of the other notes that I don't want don't bleed out. But with using the sustain pedal, it just means that I can sustain certain notes much more indefinitely. Now, no, I'm using a keyboard for this one, but on a real piano there's a little bit more what's called bleed, or otherwise a little bit more kind of bleeding over with the notes. Now, with using the pedal, there's a lot that you have to be very careful with. So, it is easy to make some really, really nice notes if you have an intention with the chord. For instance, the chord I'm going to be using here, just for instance, is our D major, D, F sharp, A. You can make a lot work with that, but if you accidentally hit a wrong note, then it might actually make it might make a little bit more of an unpleasant sound, or otherwise, if you get a note wrong, for instance, then it might make this a lot more muddy and a lot more clashing than what it needs to be. So, the tricky thing that a lot of students find is the timing of the pedal. It's all well and good to get your feet kind of eventually used to the pedal, but the trickier thing is actually when to lift it off. So I'm just going to use the camera down to my feet, so pardon me for a moment. I am wearing socks because it is cold. Now note, I'm not using a standard kind of keyboard. I'm not using a standard pedal. I'm just using an electronic pedal here. So in this particular case, I'm trying to think of the words kind of on the fly, sorry. The tricky thing is how one transitions from one set of notes to the next. If we take the intro of Clair de Lune. So, for instance, when I was doing that just now, you might have noticed that I was using the pedal a lot. While it has been a little bit since I've touched that piece myself, I always like to make sure that with the notes that I sustain, there is an amount of clarity between the notes. So, for instance, if I were to go back again, if I just held on to the pedal without changing it every bar, so you can hear that there is a lot more kind of muddied notes. While these notes may work in some of the different contexts, for the clarity of Clair de Lune and the context that is there, it's not always the best idea, at least in my interpretation of it and a lot of other people's interpretation of what I've heard. It's best to have just a clear set of lines between the notes. Now, another point of questioning that my students have trouble with is leading with that kind of when to change the pedal. End of the bar or the beginning of the bar? A lot of students of mine have, when they learn the pedal, they tend to change at the end of the bar, and it's a very easy thing to do in terms of, it's a very common mistake. So, for instance, if I were to do something like, if I were to think of a piece off the top of my head, Let me think of something. Let's use the grade 1 Piano for Leisure series book, the Japanese Koto. Now this is a very pedal-heavy piece, but this is where some of the pedaling becomes very important. So, there was even a little mistake in there as well, but that I just made as well, because I wasn't too careful with my pedaling for a bit. But the thing that I like to try to do is change the pedal just at the beginning of the next bar. I'll play an example of that one where I'm playing at the end of the bar, or I'm changing the end of the bar, pardon me. So with that one, I tend to find that when people change right at the end of the bar or just before the beginning of the next bar, there's a little bit of an extra gap, an extra uncomfortable bit of silence which comes as a result of it. It's a timing-based issue, and it is something that does take a little bit of time because everyone's different. Some people get it more easily than others. But what I tend to suggest is changing right at the beginning of the next bar, so that way, while there is a little bit of delay, while there is a little bit of muddiness, it's quickly sorted out once we've immediately gotten to the next note. So, another thing I wanted to talk about in relation with the pedaling is staccato. And other forms of articulation. So if we're familiar with staccato, well actually just to bridge the gap, staccato being detached notes. Now, with detached notes and the use of the pedal, they don't quite fit because if I were to do something like a C major scale with staccato, if you try to do that on, I mean, sure, some of it could sound a little bit more accented as well, but if I were to do that with, say, the pedal, and leading also to the fact that you've got to be very, when you're doing your scales, whether it's in piano for leisure or classical context, or even in a jazz context, it's best not to, if you're doing something like a C major scale, best not to do a scale using the pedal, because it gets far too muddy far too quickly. And it's just because because after a while, if I were to do like a cluster chord here, I'm basically just leaving all of these notes just to kind of delay and sustain out, and that would not be good in terms of producing what's more of a quality sound. So, in reference with things like staccato and dynamics, that is very hard to do. But when we're using the pedal, sometimes there are pieces in which there are specific dynamics which, even with the pedal, they're asking you to do staccato. What it more means is that if you're doing something more complex piece, so it would be Footsteps in the Snow, L'Assaut de la Neige, I think it is in French. I'll just do that a little bit harder, pardon me. But some of it asks for staccato. So in this case, it's less true staccato as in like, oh, we're playing like a hot potato. This is just more like to show the feeling of it being just, okay, very detached. It's a tricky one to pull off, but it is something that does exist. It's typically in the, where Debussy came, I mean, he hated the term, but impressionist music, that's a very particular dynamic style. And if you were to think about string instruments, for instance, as well, For those who play string instruments as well as the piano, you'll know that, particularly something like the violin or the cello, you'll know that there are other dynamics which do require a mixture of these dynamics, where it's both staccato and legato. On the violin and cello, or double bass viola, it's usually what's called spiccato, where you just kind of... it's usually an indicator of spiccato, where it's both legato as well as staccato, just creating a kind of... While it's connected, it's also loose and detached. What else? Now, legato comparatively is easier while we're doing the pedaling. However, I will say that it is surprisingly easy to make your notes more detached. If I were to do something, so if I were to improvise something, I'm using an 8 diminished scale. Leading into the G. For instance, I'm using this example to the example that I was doing just now was me attempting to create a very kind of legato movement, because it's very easy actually when we're using the pedal to actually not use any legato movement. It seems harder to not do legato on the pedaling, but the distinction that I make is that it requires phrases for it's to do with your phrasing. I mean, yeah, I was just playing some more random notes, but if I were to do something which may or may not require a pedal, I'm just doing a bit of the Rondo Bella Turca. That has to be kind of legato. But one thing that has to be present within the legato is the clarity of the phrasing, and that can be quite tricky when we're not so experienced with the pedal. I mean, for me, myself, I don't know the piece too well, but I always like to make sure that if I were to use the pedal, so with that little example I just made up just now, the distinction that I want you to hear is the clarity of the notes. Whether it's fast or slow, you need to make sure that your notes are hearable, because it's very easy to miss out a few notes. One thing I like to do when practicing legato, whether it's with a pedal or not, is make sure that I practice very slowly and just make sure that the notes are very clear. If we're playing in fast kind of semiquavers, or whether it's in triplets, we need to make sure that all the notes are heard, even if they're not always meant to be emphasized. We need to make sure that they're heard clearly. And what else? Tenuto is easier and harder to do on the pedal. I'll explain. So with the tenuto means just to put a little bit more emphasis, which isn't an accent on a note. The phrase I like to use is put a little bit more oomph to a note. So with a little example that I just made up now, you can hear the notes which weren't necessarily accented all the time, but you can hear the notes which were more clearer than others, right? The notes which are more clear or have a little bit more distinction to them were the notes I highlighted with the tenuto. Now the tenuto looks like a little, just like a little hyphenated line, really, when you look at it on sheet music. But with tenuto, it's important not to confuse it with an accent, because if it's an accent, then it's usually too loud, because accent has the implication of force to it. So, I hope this helps in reference with our teaching of the, pardon me, I'm word salad. I hope this lesson on the pedaling helps whoever listens to it, and yeah, I hope you all have a lovely day. Take care of yourselves. See you.